Well, my friends, we live in a world that is very easily offended. Have you noticed? If you've been on the internet ever, you will have noticed this. So let's talk about some offended stories. First, let's get my picture slide up here. Did you guys hear about this one yesterday? There was a church in Mississippi that was burned to the ground on purpose. So the church, there's been a lot of debate, as you know, how should we respond to COVID-19? Debate between different levels of government, especially in the United States. And in Mississippi, this church, they had closed down some of the time. They'd met some of the time when they were given an order not to meet. They were meeting now legally, and somebody burned the church down and wrote on the concrete in chalk so that it would remain on the parking lot, "Bet you stay home now, hypocrites." And yes, that's their misspelling of hypocrites, not mine. That's what they wrote there. "Bet you stay home now, hypocrites." So think for a minute what that must have been like. What kind of mindset did that person have in order to do that? A mindset where even something as simple as just meeting for church, the church was doing physical distancing. Even just as something as simple as how people are responding to COVID is grounds to go and burn down a building. That is a mind that is searching for reasons to be offended. Is your mind, in different situations in your life, searching for reasons to be offended? We had our youth group this last Friday meet for the first time physically. We met in a park. We played laser tag. They did an amazing job. They probably did physical distancing like 95% perfect. It was amazing. Part of the reason they did it so well is that there were people watching. People in the neighborhood around the park were walking by, and you could see, especially certain kinds of people would stop and they would watch for like 10 minutes. And you could get their phone out there ready to call the police, if we were hugging each other or whatever it was. But the youth did a great job. People looking for reasons. Oh, am I going to catch somebody? What's the mindset that's going on there? Once I was leading another youth group. Here's another story of someone being offended for you. I was leading a youth group at a church in Vancouver. This was about 10 years ago. Some people in this room know that church. And we were playing soccer with a youth group on the church grounds. So you got grade 7, 8, 9. I mean, we look like Care Bears. We don't look like anything dangerous, right? And we're playing soccer, and some older teenagers, young men, walk through the parking lot, 3 of them. And because we are always looking to help people grow in their relationship with God and with each other, a bunch of us said hi to these guys, even though we didn't know them. We waved at them, we said hi. They grunted and ignored us and walked off. Well, about 15 minutes later, they came back. They came back with a machete. Now, I hope that you will not be offended by the fact that I brought a machete to church. It's only a demonstration object. I don't use it for anything. I made a cross with this. That's the last thing I did was I hacked out a rough cross at a youth camp with this machete. But these guys brought a machete to fight with our youth group, who they had decided was a gang. Okay? All right, so what is the mindset that's going on there? They were convinced. What happened in that situation was I walked up to these guys with their machete, and I said, "Guys, we are not a gang. Take a look at us. We're a bunch of church kids playing soccer. We're here to read the Bible and talk about Jesus. Do you know about him? Would you like to learn more about Jesus?" They did not want to learn about Jesus. They wanted to fight. They were convinced that when we waved at them, we were making gang signs at them. Now, if you can look at a youth group of grades 7 to 9 playing soccer on a church property and decide that it's a gang trying to kill you and you need to defend yourself with a machete, you are searching for reasons to be offended. You are searching for reasons to fight. You have locked yourself in a habit of thinking, a pattern of thinking, and you can't get out of it. You cannot see reality clearly. What happened, of course, we called the police. They ran off, and then the police came and tried to hunt them down with dogs, but they didn't catch them. Sad story. So today we are talking about becoming unoffendable. We are in a series of messages at Community of Hope right now called Plan for Peace. What is God's plan for peace in our lives and in the world? The great news is that He has one. He has done everything that's necessary for us to receive His peace. Let's go ahead and read our key verse for this series of messages, which is John 14, verse 27. And it goes like this. This is Jesus speaking to us and to His closest friends on the night that He was arrested. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. So we see here in Jesus' own words, He is telling us, and we can trust Him because He came back to life from the dead. That's why we can trust Him. He is telling us that He has done everything necessary for us to have peace. What we have to do is receive His peace. And for lack of that, for lack of us receiving it, is why there is so little peace in the world and so little peace in people's lives today. Now, we're almost at the end of this series of messages. You can go back and check out many of those online. They're all online, YouTube, Facebook. But in the last 3 messages of this series, we talked about 2 weeks ago how what needs to happen in us in order to fully receive the peace of God is that we need to become, in our core identity, in the deepest part of us, simply people who follow Jesus. If everything else is stripped away, if everything that I think I am fails and falls apart in my life, what needs to be left at the center is simply this. Even if I fail at everything, even if my whole life blows up, I follow Jesus. That's what needs to be at the core. And so we talked about, in these last 3 messages, we're talking about what that looks like to follow Him. And one of the things that it looks like, which He tells us very clearly in Matthew chapter 5, we're going to read in a second, is that we need to become peacemakers. In order to fully receive the peace of God, we need to not only do what's necessary to receive it in ourselves, but we need to get on the same mission that Jesus is on. And that means becoming peacemakers in the world around us. Here's Matthew 5, verse 9. This is from a section of teaching called the Sermon on the Mount, which is Jesus' most famous section of teaching. He begins, this is all very near the beginning of the message. He says this, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God," or children of God. So in order to become more like God, we need to become people who are making peace in the world around us. We're going to see today that one of the things we have to do to achieve that is we have to become more and more unoffendable. If you are easily offended, you will not make peace in the world around you. You know it's true. But if you are unoffendable, you will be able, God will be able to use you to make peace in situations that never would have had peace otherwise. Now, in each message for this series, we have a key story. And our key story for today is the story of King Saul and King David. Can I get a shout out for the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and David? It's an amazing story. If you know it, many of you will. This story is great because most of the stories in this series, we've been looking at what not to do. The Bible is full of stories that show us what not to do in a particular situation. So most of the times we've looked at stories where that's not what we should do, and then we go and look at the teaching of Jesus to see what we should do. In this particular instance, we see David, in his relationship with King Saul, being a man who is amazingly unoffendable. And because of that, David is able to bring peace to the nation. All right, so the outlines of the story, it goes like this, right? So Saul was the first king of Israel. You can go back and read how that happened, book of 1 Samuel. Saul's the first king of Israel, and he was big guy, tough guy. Everybody thought he was amazingly good looking. He had a lot of victories in the early days, but he didn't follow after God well. And he got himself in trouble with the Philistines, right? The Philistines, and especially with this guy Goliath. You remember the story of David and Goliath? in that story, Saul and his army were facing an enemy army. And one of the enemy army, their best warrior, their biggest guy, came out and said, "Why don't you send someone out to fight me?" Well, who should that person have been? The biggest, toughest guy in the Israelite army, right? Which was King Saul. And he did not go. He was not willing to obey God in that situation, to trust God. And David comes in, and David's just a little shepherd teenager guy, and he saves Saul's butt. I mean, he comes in, nobody's willing to go fight Goliath. David does it. You know the story. He gets 5 smooth stones and a sling. He takes out this 9-foot-tall veteran warrior because he trusts God, and the Israelites win the day. So Saul owed David a lot, not only for that day when he helped the army defeat the enemies and Goliath, he owed him a lot for other things as well. Saul had panic attacks, and the Bible says an evil spirit came to torment him very often. And David was like killer on guitar, right? Or whatever it was back then. He was rocking the lyre. And he would make up these songs, and he would sing them for King Saul, and when he did, King Saul would be able to calm down from his panic attacks. And maybe some of you have experienced that kind of thing, and you turn on some song on Spotify or on YouTube to calm yourself down. Well, Saul didn't have that. All he had was David. He owed David a lot. But when that great victory over the enemies of Israel happened, they were on the way home, the whole army marching back in victory, and the people of Israel started to sing a new song. Do you remember what that song was? The song went like this. These are just the lyrics of it. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. So the people of Israel started to notice that David was kicking more butt than Saul. And Saul did not like that at all. And you see, as their relationship goes on, Saul begins to look for reasons to be offended at David. He actually begins to construct a fake reality, a reality in which he believes that David is trying to kill him, which couldn't have been further from the truth. So Saul ends up driving David out. David has to run for his life. Saul takes away David's wife, which is one of his daughters. He takes away David's position. Saul takes away, David's in the wilderness now. He's got nobody with him. He sort of gathers this band of renegades around him, rough guys who didn't have anywhere else to go. So he's got kind of the worst people around him. He's on the run, sleeping in caves. And if you've read this story, you know that what happens next is, over and over again, David is given the opportunity to kill Saul. The first time is hilarious because David and his men are hiding in a cave, right? And Saul decides to go use the washroom in that cave where David and his men are hiding him. Saul is with his army. He's out hunting David. He doesn't know where David is. He says, "Hold on, guys, I'm just going to go use the washroom." And when he goes up there, he's relieving himself in the cave, and David and his men are in the back of the cave. And David's guys are like, "Man, you got to end this right now, David. You got to end this thing. You've got to kill Saul. You are totally within your rights." And for us today, it's a little hard to realize just how within his rights David was to kill Saul at that moment. In that culture, in that time, this was an act of war. Saul was at war with him. God had just given him his enemy. And David says this, absolutely not. That guy, using the washroom in front of us, is the Lord's anointed. That guy has been appointed king of the nation by God himself. I will not touch him. So David goes up and cuts off a corner of his robe just to prove that he was there. And when Saul leaves, he comes out and says, "Look, I could have killed you, but I didn't." And Saul's like, "Oh, you love me. You really aren't trying to kill me." But then Saul keeps on hunting him down. And this same pattern is repeated again and again, where David has the opportunity to kill Saul, but he does not. The end of the story is that eventually Saul is killed in battle by the enemies of the nation, and everyone thinks that David is going to be super happy when Saul dies. Instead of being super happy, David falls down weeping when he hears that Saul has died. He actually writes another song, a funeral song for Saul. to show how much he loved him. Because of this, because of the way that David was, a man who was very much like God in his heart, David was able, with God's power, to bring peace to the nation. And that's one of our points for today, is that if you are unoffendable, the unoffendable people are able to make peace. The unoffendable are able to make peace. There's somebody else who's an even greater example for us of being unoffendable. Can you think of who that is? On the night that Jesus was arrested for doing nothing wrong. And then he was beaten, and then he was crucified. This was the most unjust thing that had ever happened, that ever will happen. He could have easily turned himself toward anger, toward defending himself, toward being offended at those who were literally killing him, and yet he did not. On trial, he was silent, trusting God, trying even then to help the people who were around him, even though they were completely against him, and they were completely in the wrong. Later on, when he's now been beaten all night, and he's carried his cross to the mountain where they're going to crucify him. And as they're crucifying him, you remember this astonishing moment. This is one of the high water marks of the whole Bible in my mind. Jesus, better than anyone else who has ever lived, he is able to pray for the people who are killing him in the moment that they're doing it. Can you imagine this? Even then, he's not offended by the fact that they're crucifying him. He prays that God would forgive them because they don't understand. Please help them. Two robbers are crucified next to him, and one of them is heaping abuse on him. The other one says, "Please, can you please forgive me? Help me, let me enter your kingdom." What would you have been like in that moment? You're dying on the cross. Jesus is ready immediately to forgive that man. Yes, enter. This is a man who actually is guilty. Yes, today you will be with me in paradise. Jesus is absolutely unoffendable in the face of death itself and the worst thing that has ever happened to any human being. And because of it, he is able to make peace for all human beings. Now, that's the vision. What would it be like if we could become, even to any significant degree, unoffendable like David, unoffendable like Jesus, able to make peace in the world around us? What would your relationships become like? What would your workplace become like through you? What would your home and your extended family become like through you if you could really be unoffended when those people do all those bad things to you? What would it be like? That's the vision. But the question now is, how do we become like that? It seems so far from where we're at, doesn't it? Somebody wrote on the live stream earlier, yeah, this is a good topic. I fail at this all the time, and so I try not to think about it too much. Well, Dad, that's not the way. Yeah, it was my dad. Anyways, so what do we do? How do we become unoffendable? So here we're going to go to a section of teaching that's also found in Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus, just a little bit further than the verse we read earlier. And let's read these verses, starting at verse 38. Jesus says this: "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. So you've heard that it was said, defend yourself, man. Stand up for your rights. Don't let those people push you around. If they hit you, hit them back, knock them down. Be a man. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person." What? "If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic," I don't have any tunics, "let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, Do this so that you may be sons and daughters of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to shine on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. You see here what Jesus is doing. He is elaborating on what he already started with earlier in that message. That those who are peacemakers will be called sons and daughters of God because they'll be like him. And here he is giving us some very specific advice on how to become more like that. How to allow God to work in us. So a couple of things. This is not a section of teaching that is a law. Jesus is not saying that you can never defend yourself. Or that if there are people who are doing bad things to you, you just need to let them. That is not what he is saying at all. That is not what he did in his own life. He is showing us how to become unoffendable. How to remain in a place where we're dealing with the problem and trying to help the person. Whether that means resisting them or being kind to them and helping them in some way, it will mean different things at different times. It does not mean letting them walk all over us, but it does mean we do not shift into a place where we are defending ourselves and trying to get back at them. We don't go there. That's what he's showing us how to do. Now, maybe you're tuning in on the live stream and you haven't heard a lot about this. Maybe this is the first little bit you're hearing about Jesus. You've never read this section before, and this is striking you all as new and amazing. Some of us who are watching this have heard this section of teaching many, many times. So I'm going to sum this up, what Jesus is trying to say to us here, his advice to us on how to become unoffendable, in a short way that hopefully strikes us in a new way and helps us see what he wants us to do in our lives. So let's bring that point up here. What Jesus is telling us to do is help people you are mad at. That's what he's suggesting here. People who have offended you, he is suggesting that we go and find a way to help them. His descriptions show different situations that in his time were very common. Situations where someone, the slap across the cheek, it's clearly someone has slapped you across the right cheek, the right side of your face. That means they have given you a backhanded slap. This is not actually someone who's attacking you like they're going to have a fight with you. This is someone who's given you, in that culture, the ultimate offense, ultimate disrespect. Think about for a minute what kinds of things that is in our culture. Man, we are an easily offended people for the most part these days. What is the ultimate sign of disrespect in our culture? Maybe it's something like someone disagreed with you on your Facebook post. That's the ultimate sign of disrespect in our culture. At least sometimes it seems like it. What are the things that really tempt you toward offense? Jesus is saying, in those moments, you need to find a way to help and do good to that person that you are offended at or are tempted to be offended at. Now, this is something that's going to be painful. This is something that will hurt if you really do it. Imagine, maybe you've got that person in your mind right now. Maybe that person's in this room or in the room that you're in at home. I hope not, but maybe. That person who you really are offended at. Maybe, your spouse. You are feeling very offended at something that your spouse did. And if you ask God what you're supposed to do right in that moment when you're so offended, and God says, you're supposed to go downstairs and help your spouse do the dishes. Now, maybe you haven't been in that situation yet, but for some people who have been, that can be a moment, or whatever else it is. Maybe it's not the dishes, but doing that thing to help them when they've done something against you sometimes feels like ripping out your guts. It feels like the thing that would hurt you the most if you will do it. If you will gather your courage. You will remember in that moment that, first of all, before anything else that I am, before I am even a person who should be respected, I am one who follows Jesus. That's who I am in the deepest place. If you will gather all that up in that moment, you will take all your energy and say, even though this is the thing I least want to do, my friend at school has stabbed me in the back, talked about me behind my back. They've spread lies about me, and now they're asking me for help with their homework, and I know they're going to fail if I don't help them. I'm going to let them fail. That's the last thing I want to do. If you will take all of that energy that you know you want to follow Jesus with, and you will say, yes, I will. I will go and do it for Christ's sake. God will change you. He will use that moment to make you more and more unoffendable. And you will be able, as time goes on, to make peace in situations that never would have had peace. You will become a peacemaker for Christ's sake. And that's the most powerful thing there is. That's what this world needs more than anything else. The final thing that Jesus says there is to pray for your enemies. That's something you can do even if you're not sure of a way that you can genuinely help a person who has offended you. Force yourself. Force yourself onto your knees and pray, not that God would strike them dead, not that God would make their lives awful or that He would show them the great error of their ways. Pray that He would do good for that person in whatever way you can. God will change you. He'll use you to change the world. The last thing I want to say, I've mentioned Facebook a few times on here in this message. And as we've been online during the lockdown, people, it seems, have become more and more easily offended. Right now, there's tons of offense being taken over COVID lockdown and just how people are doing it. I hope no one has taken offense this morning. Don't come to church looking for ways that you can be mad about how people are distancing or not. Don't judge people for how they're doing it out in the world or whether they think there should be more restrictions or less. I think I'm going to be shot by both sides when I say this. Get ready for the Facebook war. But we need to be people who are unoffendable for Christ's sake. Let's pray. Let's ask Him for help, and we'll continue in worship.